Hello, everyone. We have made it to period 9. Before jumping into the terms and topics, I want to say the closer that we get to the present, the more difficult it is to identify the most important information. It takes time for the dust of the past to settle, and for historians to make sense of what was an important long-lasting development, or an event that would have long-lasting effects, or Supreme Court cases and pieces of legislation that would go down as landmarks. With that in mind, I did my best to identify the key terms that go along with the concepts from the College Board framework. So let's go. If you remember back to the end of period 8, the economy was experiencing slow growth at the same time of high inflation. Reagan and his Federal Reserve Chairman, Paul Volcker, attacked the problem with supply-side economics, also called Reaganomics. The first thing Reagan targeted were income tax rates. During World War II, they were extremely high on the wealthy, and they were gradually reduced over time. But Reagan wanted them cut drastically for individuals and businesses. The thinking was that would encourage investment and production on the supply side, and less taxes on individuals would lead to increased demand and consumption. To counter possible inflationary pressures, the Federal Reserve kept high interest rates to prevent inflation. There were also other aspects to Reaganomics as well. A highlighted one was deregulation of industry, and the government took a more hostile stance towards unions. That is shown in Reagan firing all of the federal air traffic controllers who went on strike. The 1980s did see increased economic growth, and stagflation was broken. However, government spending remained high, and with the decrease in tax revenue, that brought about high yearly deficits and big increases in the national debt. Also, much of the gains in economic growth went to the wealthy, and this was the beginning of a marked and continuous increase in income inequality. The 1970s resurgence in religiosity carried on into the 1980s, and religious conservatives became politically active and influential. They fought against feminism, abortion rights, pornography, homosexuality, and promoted, quote, family values, not just in the church, but also in the political arena. Television evangelist preachers like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson gained huge followings, which they turned into influence with the Republican Party and Ronald Reagan, making up the wing of social conservatives. Throughout the 1980s and early 90s, another major aspect of the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations was the fall of the Soviet Union. In the 1970s, the Soviet Union also experienced stagnation in their planned economy, and there were increasing underground subversive movements in Eastern European bloc countries and Soviet satellite states. After a series of leadership changes in the late 70s and early 80s, the reformer Mikhail Gorbachev took power and brought about two reforms that were meant to revitalize the Soviet Union. The first was glasnost, which meant the Soviet Union would allow more freedom of expression, and also perestroika, which loosened up some state control of the economy. The reforms were popular, but they also led the Soviet public to demand more of them. At the same time, the US was pressuring the Soviets with increased military spending, and the Soviets were struggling to keep up. From the late 1980s to the early 1990s, the Soviet Union broke apart, and Eastern Europe flung off Soviet influence. The Berlin Wall came down, and Germany reunified. For Eastern European nations and former Soviet states, the 1990s and beyond held great opportunity, but also a lot of uncertainty. While the end of the Cold War was a great triumph for the United States, there were also foreign policy blunders, including the Iran-Contra affair. Previously, Iran had an Islamic revolution, deposing the secular Shah and bringing in the reign of the Ayatollahs. During the revolution, the U.S. embassy was sieged, and American hostages were held for over a year. On the other side of the world, the U.S. was ever engaged in Latin American affairs, trying to stamp out any socialist or pro-Soviet Union regimes. In the Central American country of Nicaragua, a democratic election brought in the socialist Sandinistas. The CIA trained and funded a Sandinista opposition group called the Contras. The Congress stepped in and forbade any more help for the Contras, and there were also laws against arming hostile Iran in the Middle East. The Reagan administration, in a strange lateral move, sold weapons to Iran and then tried to use the funds from those weapons sales to support the Contras back in Nicaragua. The scheme surfaced, which led to a big investigation centered around a Colonel Oliver North as the mastermind. Eventually, though, he was actually acquitted. He would go on to a career commenting in Fox News segments and president of the NRA. With the Soviet Union dissolving, the U.S. became the world's sole superpower, capable of punishing countries for hostile aggressions against their neighbors nearly anywhere in the world. The Middle East, with its large oil reserves, was an area of importance and influence for the U.S. The country of Iraq, headed by, at one time, U.S.-supported dictator Saddam Hussein, took aggressive action and invaded its smaller but oil-rich neighbor, Kuwait. The United States gathered a large international coalition and bombed Iraqi positions for 40 days, and then followed that up with a storming of Kuwait that quickly dislodged the Iraqi army. However, Saddam was not deposed by the coalition or his own people, and remained in power until the Second Iraq War in 2003. The popular Ronald Reagan served 2 terms as president, and then his vice president, George H.W. Bush, served another term. However, Bush lost his re-election campaign to moderate Arkansas Democrat Bill Clinton. Clinton's first 2 years in office had some blunders, including a failed attempt at health care reform. Amongst the Republican ranks, Congressman Newt Gingrich rose to prominence with his Contract with America plan. It helped Republicans sweep into power during the 1994 midterm elections. The plan called for significant tax cuts, reductions in welfare programs, anti-crime initiatives, and cutbacks in federal regulations. While they were not on friendly terms with Democrats, Republicans were able to work with moderate Democrats and Clinton himself to get many of those items addressed and laws passed in Congress. One of those items that would have major effects was the Welfare to Work Initiative, officially named the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act. This bipartisan piece of legislation limited welfare assistance to needy families and encouraged states through grants to increase job training. At a time of low unemployment, it was seen as a great positive by many. However, it did have many critics, especially on the left side of the political spectrum. A massively important topic and process throughout this time period is globalization. A combination of several items, including the end of the Cold War, the expansion of the World Trade Organization, along with regional free trade agreements like NAFTA, and new technologies from the internet to the growth of international travel, helped to expand the spread of political, cultural, and economic connections among countries, businesses, and individuals around the world. There were many positives to globalization, especially for some developing countries like China. However, there were downsides as well. Looking specifically at the US, it saw previously American-based multinational corporations move their manufacturing facilities to countries with cheaper labor and less regulations, resulting in a steep loss of well-paying blue-collar jobs. Another hallmark of all of Period 9 were the raging cultural debates. As we saw earlier, the moral majority pushed back against some of the liberal advances of the 1960s and 70s. Liberals also pushed back against the moral majority as well. This is seen in the cultural and increasingly political struggle between traditionalists and secular liberals over hot-button topics like abortion rights, LGBTQ rights, music, of which both rock and hip-hop were targeted for censorship, and fundamentalists were also concerned about the supposed increased secularization of society, declaring that liberals were waging a war on Christmas. The major candidates in the 2000 presidential election were Republican candidate George W. Bush, who was the governor of Texas and son of former President George H.W. Bush, and for the Democrats, Al Gore, former senator of Tennessee and then vice president under Bill Clinton. It was an incredibly tight election that came down to whoever won the state of Florida's electoral votes. In that state, the result was in dispute, as the raw vote total had a slight lead for George W. Bush. However, recounts were ordered, and issues arose with the Florida ballot itself, as voters had to poke holes in chads to indicate their vote. Some were partially poked. Anyways, the recount and legal challenges were carried out over a series of weeks and into the month of December. Eventually, it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, which decided to end the recount, and that resulted in Bush taking Florida and winning the election. One of President Bush's major initiatives was called No Child Left Behind. Historically, education had been left up to the state governments, albeit with a few federal laws to help and protect certain groups. However, there was growing concern that U.S. students were falling behind their peers in developed countries. The No Child Left Behind legislation required all schools that received federal funding to administer standardized tests with the hope that it would raise educational standards and benchmarks, and that would result in improved results. The test results also played a part in a school's rating or report card, and these report cards varied by individual states. There was also a push to create common educational standards across the country in what became known as Common Core Curriculum. In the wake of the horrific terrorist attacks on September 11, 2001, America entered into the War on Terror, which was fought on many fronts, from the cyber world to the battlefield. The USA Patriot Act was passed to aid this fight. The title of the act is an acronym standing for Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism. The act gave the government new powers to monitor suspected terrorists and their associates, including the ability to access personal information. Over the past 2 decades, the increased powers of surveillance have been criticized by people on both sides of the political spectrum. There are a lot of similarities to other wartime restrictions seen throughout U.S. history. The Great Recession from 2007 to 2009 was the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. From 2003 to 2006, there was a housing boom built on subprime loans and stock market speculation, aided by the deregulation of the banking system in the previous decades. As the subprime mortgage market tumbled, major banks and investment firms began folding, or were in danger of going under. From there, the crisis spread to other areas of the economy as well. It was looking like a repeat of the Great Depression. In the midst of this was the historic 2008 election, won by America's first black president, Barack Obama. During the last days of the Bush administration and the first months of the Obama administration, the federal government and Federal Reserve took extraordinary actions to keep the economy from completely collapsing. The federal government took over the failing mortgage firms, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and propped up major banks like JP Morgan and American auto companies like General Motors. The Federal Reserve reduced interest rates to zero and put in a program of quantitative easing, which helped to put money back into the economy. The Reserve also took the unprecedented action of buying up bad subprime mortgages and basically hid them from the market. It would be a long, slow recovery from the Great Recession. However, another depression was avoided. The Affordable Care Act, also called Obamacare, is arguably the most significant piece of legislation passed during the Obama administration. It was a highly partisan piece of legislation, with every Republican candidate thereafter vowing to overturn it. Initially, President Obama was aiming for some sort of universal healthcare coverage, but the act would fall short of that. It did have popular and unpopular aspects as well. Some of the popular aspects were no longer could insurance companies deny coverage to anyone because of pre-existing conditions, and pre-existing conditions had to be covered. Children can be under their parents' plan until they're 26, and there are subsidies for individuals buying health insurance on their own. Some of the unpopular aspects were the mandate that everyone has to have health insurance, which is now gone, and some businesses are unhappy with the law that required them to provide an employer healthcare plan if their business has over 50 full-time employees. A final landmark Supreme Court case was Obergefell v. Hodges in 2015. Groups of same-sex couples in multiple states sued to challenge the constitutionality of bans on same-sex marriage. They argued that the bans violated the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. In a close 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court agreed with the same-sex couples and said there was no difference between a same-sex union and an opposite-sex union, so same-sex couples should be afforded equal rights. And the final term, which I debated on whether or not I should include it, as I think it is pretty unlikely it will come up on an AP test anytime soon, but I thought it was important to at least give a brief summary of it because of its prevalence, and that is Make America Great Again, or MEGA for short. This was candidate and President Trump's slogan and guide to policymaking. Some of the specific positions and policy points which relate to the term are ending America's reliance on Chinese products and protect and reinvigorate U.S. manufacturing. With this, we saw the return of tariffs, and that halted the previous decade's move towards more free trade. In foreign policy, the term meant an America First approach, which shunned some of the international organizations and agreements like NATO and the Paris Climate Accords. This was to reassert U.S. sovereignty in foreign policy. Candidate and President Trump also focused extensively on curbing immigration. This included immigration bans from certain countries, a more stringent immigration process, and the push for a border wall to stretch across the southern border with Mexico. President Trump also reduced environmental protections and aimed to help stimulate the U.S. fossil fuel industry, including coal, oil, and natural gas. And finally, there is the debate around gun laws. After a series of mass shootings, including at schools, there were calls for more restrictions and controls around firearms. President Trump, Republicans, and the NRA pushed back against those calls. And on the federal level, very little has been done in either direction. Okay, that does it for Period 9 Key Terms. Subscribe to the channel for more APUSH breakdowns of key information and sources, and also for more AP test reviews. I got some things in the works for this year's AP test, and I think they'll be a great help to those taking the upcoming exam.